Hello, and welcome to the Angus and Pete Show. Views and opinions are strictly those of the presenters and their guests and should not be taken as advice. Goodness knows, we're not qualified to advise you about anything. Side effects may include mild amusement and occasional enlightenment with feelings of embarrassment, apathy, disappointment, and pity.
Welcome to episode 7. I'm Angus Pacey.
And I'm Pete Brown, and we are the Angus and Pete Show.
The place where you can listen to two guys chatting about that riveting world of customer engagement.
That's customer engagement, aka call centre, contact centre, customer service, customer experience, CX, etc., etc., etc.
And if you want to find out more about us, check us out on LinkedIn.
Check us out on LinkedIn. We don't do big, bad bios here, do we, Angus?
No egos in this room.
Well, not many. What's in the post bag?
We've had quite a bit of feedback. I think that's been really good. I think 3 people stand out. Kevin from Boston in the USA. So we've actually made it across the pond, which is good. He's been listening to part 1 and part 2, and he says he finds those RFP episodes interesting. But he says the US does things differently. They don't do many formal RFPs for selection. But during the sales process, they've got quite detailed scrutiny on the suppliers and the products. But that only happens after the order's been placed, and the contract itself defines the deliverables. So we see a very different sales motion in the US to what we see here in Europe.
If there aren't as many RFPs going on in the US, maybe we should all move over there and do selling the easy way.
Definitely will make people's lives a lot less stressful, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, have a think about that.
The second one was from Gregor from Warsaw. He says, I'm a seller. How do I decide whether to respond to an RFP or not? And I think that is a very interesting question.
Yeah, and I think we're going to cover that right now in this episode.
And then the sort of third one which stood out, also aligned into what we're going to talk about. Jeremy from Birmingham. What can I do if I smell a rat or think the RFP process is flawed?
Goodness, God forbid.
I bet that everybody asks that question and they don't know what to do.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Gregor. We'll be straight on to those.
Yeah, so let's get on with it. So I think everybody listening, hopefully you've covered the part 1 and part 2. If you haven't, hit the pause button, go back and listen to those. But we covered in RFP part 1 and 2 the real fucking problem, the right fucking process. Now, here in part 3, we're going to talk about the remarkable fucking proposal that you are all going to be crafting once you've got all our tips and tricks.
So this one's for the sellers, right, Angus? So the first one was sort of just framing the thing. Part 2 was really about that process that buyers go through or could go through. And this one's for our selling colleagues.
Correct. We want to make sure sellers don't waste their time by qualifying RFP opportunities properly up front. Also some tips on producing high quality RFP responses, but generally just to stop chasing the rainbows and the unicorns.
Okay.
We've been traveling around EMEA over the last couple of years, and the one thing that all the salespeople, the sellers have been telling us is that their RFP conversion rates are 15% on average.
Yeah.
And that's quite often that's on a good day. Some of them have got RFP response rates that are as low as 2%.
Yeah, terrible. How does that happen?
Go back to part 1 and 2. Getting that RFP, what do you do with it? My world as a product manager prior to now, we got pulled into every RFP pretty much that got responded to. And 2 questions always came to us in the product team. One was, how do we fill the gaps in our solution? We don't have these features. We don't have that features. How do we fill the gap? The second question that came out is, how far can we discount our commercials to win?
And this is before the RFP's even been responded to, right? This is right up front.
This is right up front. And generally it's at the lastminute.com because they're suddenly faced with a deadline that's looming and they need help quick. These are things that I saw from a product perspective on a regular basis. Now, you were probably much closer to crafting those RFP responses and deep into them.
I'm afraid
So
I
kind of
was.
what were your observations as that went? You were the one working with the people that used to come and ask us the questions.
Where to start? I'll tell you where to start, actually, with a thing that not a lot of people know, and if they know, they don't remember. From a buyer's perspective, an RFP is a choice that they make. Buyers have a choice to use the RFP process for a procurement or not. And if they don't use an RFP process for procurement, they all have the option to make a direct award to a vendor, to a seller organisation. They don't have to go through this protracted process. Purchasing will say that they do, and they may have rules and regulations, but there are many organisations, in fact all organisations, in the public and the private sector that can make direct awards without going through an RFP process, without going through a protracted question and answer due diligence process. I was talking to a sales guy just 3 days ago who told me that in reviewing 2024, looking at a mixture of public and private sector procurements that they were aware of, 75% of the deals that they were working on, and these are customer engagement deals, 75% were direct awarded. They didn't go to RFP. There was a small procurement process. Give us 3 quotes. Let's do a little bit of due diligence to make sure this thing fits. Bang, we're going to buy something. My point is, as a seller, if you get an RFP, the first question you should be asking is, why has the buyer issued this RFP when they have the option to make a direct award?
Ask the customer that question.
Absolutely. If you've got a relationship, you will probably know the answer to this. If you haven't got a relationship, you should actually be asking whether you should be responding to the RFP anyway, but it's a good question to ask. Remember we said in part 2, when we were talking about the games and the tricks that buyers play in this thing, quite often there are other agendas at play. Why would a buyer issue an RFP rather than making a direct award? There are a number of reasons. One of them is that they have genuinely decided that they want to go to the market, they want an open and transparent procurement process, they want to see what's out there, they want to generate a bit of competitive attention, and they want to buy on the basis of those responses. That is not what happens in the majority of cases, in my experience.
That's the honest process.
Yeah, it's what it's supposed to be. There are a couple of other reasons. One of them is we need to find out what's going on in the market. Let's issue an RFP. Because if you call it a request for proposal, it sounds like you're going to buy something. If you call it a request for information or a soft market test, salespeople just don't respond to it. So they have to play a little bit of a game here. So watch out for those because they happen. The third one is, in my experience, a very common scenario. The buyer has got themselves into a situation with their incumbent seller, and things aren't all sweetness and light. The relationship's broken, they're not getting the best out of each other, it's not right. And many buyers use the RFP process to publicly declare, we're out there looking, and it's a stick to beat their incumbent supplier.
Yeah, they're sticking pins in to get them to jump
Right.
a little bit, maybe.
So when you're qualifying this thing, first thing is ask yourself and the customer, why RFP? The reason you want to know this is they're expensive and time-consuming things to deal with. You know this, right? You've dealt with it. When I was speaking to some of the people that gave us feedback on the other episodes, some of the people that have been in touch, there's an estimation which goes up and down that an RFP costs about £25,000 or your currency equivalent to respond to a customer engagement RFP.
If that's north of $30,000.
Exactly. It's not an insignificant amount of money anyway. It's a huge amount of money if you're not going to get any return on it. So why spend it willy-nilly? You wouldn't spend $30,000, £25,000 without doing your due diligence on anything else in business. So why would you spend it on an RFP?
Surely if you're going to spend that amount of money on responding to an RFP, there must be some sort of process that is followed in order to effectively allocate those resources.
There are. Some of those processes are the salesperson with their emotional response, which says, we've got to respond to this RFP. We've got to respond to this RFP because I know the customer. We've got to respond to this RFP because I've got nothing else in my pipeline and I've got to do something. That is a going out of business strategy if you do it that way. the most effective processes I've seen have been based on a review board approach, i.e. a group of people from key parts of the seller business, and their job is to objectively review and evaluate the fit and the opportunity.
So they're putting a bit of oversight into this process, not leaving it to a bid team to just go and do it.
Right up front. Now, that requires a couple of things to happen. First of all, it requires the person who gets an RFP to get it straight to this team of people. Because to your point, too often our RFP response is compromised because they're dragging people in at the last minute. If you have a process up front to make a business decision about whether this is a good opportunity or not, then you've got a much better chance of making the right decision. The appropriate people are salespeople. Absolutely. They're the front end. They understand the customer relationship, or they should do. Technical pre-sales people, product management, people who understand not just what the product does today, but what it's going to be doing tomorrow. Commercial and legal people. We said in episode 2 that there are reams and reams of pages usually that are about compliance and legalities and all of those things that absolutely need to be nailed. People from your projects and implementation teams who are going to be delivering on this stuff, as well as the support organisation, all need to be involved. And if you're really doing it properly and you really want to get the best result, you should also have a dedicated bid manager, someone who's pulling all this stuff together, effectively project managing the bid, absolutely. And crucially, some oversight from a senior leader in the business. They are there to ask all the stupid questions. That's what senior leadership is for. Ask all the stupid questions. They're very well qualified to do it, and it's very effective in these situations. Why are we doing this? So the first thing you do is have an RFP review process based on a board, a set of criteria, and based on some objective analysis of what's in front of them. And actually, I've made it sound like you need every man and his dog involved. I've worked in small businesses. Just 3 or 4 people can do this. Multidiscipline team, looking at this thing, asking all the stupid questions.
What is the context for that review board? Do they start at a point where we're going to do it, or do they start at a point we're not going to do it? What way works best?
I would say a no bid mentality is the best place to start.
That's going to scare the hell out of most salespeople.
Assume that this is not a good opportunity. Assume that it is a default no bid, and you build up from there. It is the job of the sales team, and it is the job of the board actually to convince itself that there is a compelling and winning proposition that we can articulate in this RFP, and we have the relationship with the buyer to enable it and make it work. They're the key things. If you start from a no bid mentality, it's a much more effective way to wiggle out where the problems are, to wiggle out the weaknesses. Nothing's perfect. It's perfectly acceptable to bid on an opportunity where you've got gaps. What isn't fine is pretending that you've got a great fit when you know you haven't, and flipping a coin and hoping for the best. That is a going out of business strategy.
I think there's another benefit that comes to this. If you start at that no bid stake in the ground, and you work through with everybody on that board and all the stakeholders on that board that are involved to we are going to do this, all the stakeholders are aligned, and they will all know why they need to allocate resources to make this successful. Right. So you've got all your stakeholders lined up in one easy lesson. That's very difficult if you start the reverse way.
Right. You've got buy-in up front. The other thing that is very tempting, and I've seen this a lot, as part of that bid, no bid decision, quite often the first thing that is said is, we've already got 6 bids on the go. We've got no time to do this. That's a dangerous thing, because priorities change, opportunities change. So what I've always said to teams that I've worked with is that may be the case, but this is the last thing we speak about. Resourcing is the last thing we speak about. What we first need to decide is whether we have a valid, attractive opportunity in front of us. But don't let your perceived ability to meet deadlines and get the job done get in the way of that initial review, because potentially you'll walk past things that you really should be engaging with. The other thing that this is a statement of the bleeding obvious as far as I'm concerned, but it's something that gets overlooked a lot, decide if you want the business. Do you want this customer? Are they the sort of customer that you would enjoy dealing with, or do they look like a whole world of hurt before you even start? I heard a story just before our last episode from a sales colleague who said we were going through the process. Everything looked good. We had this great big RFP document for a customer engagement solution, all sorts of requirements, all sorts of complications. We could absolutely nail the requirement. Big tick in the box. Only when we'd started did the senior stakeholder say, just before we go any further, how much money are we going to make out of this? We pour through the RFP and there's a pertinent piece of information missing. When you sell customer engagement and contact center solutions, you'll know that a lot of the time the scale comes from the number of agents that you have. There was no mention of it. When they went and spoke to the organisation, who shall remain nameless, they said, "Oh, it's quite significant. It's 13 concurrent agent licenses. That's what we require. No bid. It's going to cost us more than that to get the RFP response out of the door."
Doesn't make sense. I mean, I remember a small customer. We were the incumbent, geographically dispersed around the UK, came to renewal time. They threatened the RFP. I remember sitting with the commercial team and the finance guys, and they said two things we're going to do. One, we no bidding this, the renewal, never an RFP, renewal. The second thing that we're going to, we go to the customer and say, we will write a check for £25,000 for them to go to somebody else.
Right.
Because we are losing money on this customer.
Right.
So I think your point there is really, really important. It doesn't matter whether you fit, whether you've got a good relationship with a customer. If the commercials don't make you money, get out.
Right. Now, actually, in some cases, a loss leader doing something strategic may be the right thing to do. I guess the message really is, if you're going to do it, know why you're going to do it in absolute fundamental business terms, in cash terms, in profit terms, in loss terms. If you don't understand it, you shouldn't be getting into it. So
you've got a decision now. You've made a decision to bid. All right, we'll talk about what you need to do there. You make a decision not to bid. Let's take the first one, because I think that's easy to deal with. What the hell do you do? Just go quiet and ignore it?
No, communication's king. We said this when we were talking about what buyers should be doing from a best practice perspective. Same applies to sellers. I've always made it very clear to buyers, if I'm going to no bid, why? Tell them why. And you know what? Sometimes you might be surprised at what happens next. If you tell a buyer about your concerns, if you tell a buyer about their ridiculous timescales, if you tell a buyer about the word on the street is that they've already decided to stick with their incumbent, you might get a different response. So be open, be transparent, be honest. If you have decided to bid, then there's a lot of work to do. When you're going through that work, when you're going through that process, there's one thing that is really important, and that is to have the discipline and the courage to be completely honest at every stage of your responses and include full information, particularly around commercials. If you don't, it will come and bite you in the backside. Absolutely it will. And what I've also found is, we said in episode 1 that some sellers, not all sellers, maybe the minority of sellers, but some are a little bit creative with the facts when it comes to RFPs, because they believe that let's tell them what they want to hear and we'll get through to the next round and we'll sort it out then. I believe that if you're open and honest and clear and comprehensive with your information, what that does is raises a whole load of questions that are typically aimed and focused at those people who have been creative with the facts. So again, it's just a way of qualifying. It's a way of demonstrating openness. And also, whilst the RFP process is a bit of a monster, it's like any other sales process. The key thing is that the buyer trusts the seller to start with. And that's the way you start that trust process.
It's easy to say, this is a complex question to answer. We need more discussion on this. We can't answer it right now. Than to invent something and say, yeah, we do it. We can tick all those boxes. And then suddenly that comes, absolutely, that'll come and bite you in the ass later. If you're thinking about building those responses, and this I saw when I was a product manager a lot, bid managers and engineers are dumped with the task of filling out those line by line responses, which can be long.
Yeah.
And I've looked at many of these because, product managers quite often get asked to review answers that have been written by people. Quite often we see they're very wordy. They waffle because they don't know what they want to say. Now, but I've got a product manager view on that. What's your view from a sales side on this one? What have you seen?
Do you know what? It's really simple. An RFP is basically a series of questions. Answer the bloody question. Right up front. Bluff. Bottom line up front. If you don't answer the question in the first sentence, you have failed. You failed to make it easy for the customer to understand that answer. And remember, they are scoring these RFPs. Put yourself in their shoes. You've got 10 RFPs to score, and one of them has highlighted the answer to your question right up front in bold, and then maybe they've embellished it a little bit, but there is the answer. And then you've got another one that waffles on for 2 pages about a whole load of stuff that isn't relevant with some screenshots and some other stuff, and you've got to read through it and you've got to find the answer. What are you going to do?
You don't. I've done it. I've done this. I've sat with 10 RFPs in front of me, and you've got 100 questions and answers that you've got to score. That's your scoring block. You've got not enough time to do it. And what you do is, I don't have the answer, cross the line 0.
Right. So quite often, the buyer will give you some clues. They may tell you that they want an answer around this many words. They may tell you that they want you to focus on specific things. Quite often, to be fair, and we said this in the last episode, buyers don't help themselves by asking big, vague questions, and then they get big, vague answers, and that doesn't help anybody. But answer the question. It's actually quite a good strategy to not give too much away in an RFP. Answer the question, and when you start getting buyers coming back to say, actually, we want a little bit more information about this one, as far as I'm concerned, that's a buying signal. They've read it, they're looking at it.
It's okay to leave breadcrumbs in your answers as well.
Absolutely.
Answer the question and leave breadcrumbs so that they go, what about?
But the bottom line is, don't make your buyer trawl through a whole lot of guff to find the answer, because they won't do it any more than you would do it. Then you get your whole document together and you've got all these answers. You really need to tie it together with something. And one of the things that really irritates me is the management summary that is obviously a template cookie cut from the corporate library, which is all about how many offices we've got and how many people we've got and how many customers we've got, and just doesn't address the issue. And for me, a management summary is very simple. You're replaying your understanding of the requirement. You're replaying your understanding of the outcome that the customer's looking for, and you're going to tell them how much it's going to cost them to get there and what the benefits are going to be. And if you can't get that on 2 sides of A4, then you've failed, because most C-suite people that I've met will look at the management summary and they'll flip straight through to the pricing, and that is their decision criteria.
The other thing, just in terms of your point on the management summary is very well made, because the question I've had from salespeople, but where do we put all our corporate bump and strategy? It's called a bloody appendix.
Yes.
Do not put it in the body of what you are responding to, unless they explicitly asked for the history of your company by the year. Don't put it in. It's fine to put it in the appendix, and then they can choose to read it. And if they've never dealt with you before, never heard of you, that might be very valuable information. But don't put it in the document itself.
So You've got your qualification, you've got your incisiveness when it comes to answering questions, you've got your document, you've built your management summary, and then it's time to send that thing back to the buyer. When you do, remember one thing. Life isn't fair, and nor are RFPs. Don't take it personally. Over the years, buyers and sellers have worked very hard to create the RFP monster. It is a monster. I'm sure if you spoke to buyers and sellers and they were honest about it, they would work very hard to unpick this and simplify things again. But here we are, the genie's out of the bottle. It is a monster, but the seller has a very straightforward job, and that job is to understand the game. Don't bid on bad fit, bad return business. That is all.
It is pretty simple if you really boil it down.
And if you don't know whether it's a bad fit or a good fit, and you don't know whether it's a bad return or a good return, then you've just answered your own question. It's a no bid. Stop chasing rainbows. The only salespeople that chase rainbows when it comes to RFPs and bad fit are those that don't have enough opportunity in their pipeline. Think about the number of phone calls you could make. Think about the number of outbound contacts you can make while you're sitting there trawling through an RFP.
Right, think how many weekends and holidays you can have back.
Well, there you go.
I think we've got some takeaways. I mean, that makes sense. I think I can think off the top of my head of a couple of really succinct takeaways. One, make sure you've got a formal RFP review process that's got the right people in it. I think that's
Absolutely.
a very important one. Second one, what you're saying was start with a no bid mentality, and then you've got to work to convince your stakeholders in that review team that we've got a compelling and winning proposition, but B, this is going to be good business. You've got to decide whether you want the business or not. Then the other one is, if you decide to bid, then be honest at every stage, both with your audience that's going to be reading this, but also as you're putting it together with yourselves around the commercials. Be very honest about that. Don't pull the wool over everybody's eyes internally and externally. And probably, you know what, the most important point that you made today, bluff. Answer the question in the first sentence so these poor reviewers can actually score you properly. And I think that to me, that's the most important one, because I've seen so much waffle in that.
I bet you've created quite a bit of waffle as well, Angus, in your time, but we'll leave that for another episode.
That's an entire episode, how to do waffle. And then last one, just before you go to bed, remember, life's not fair, nor RFPs.
They're not.
We collectively have created that monster. Now we've got to live with it, but do the best you can for the buyer and the seller.
And they cost money, and you're not guaranteed a return. So be very careful how you spend it and very careful how you deploy those resources.
Cool. I think we're done. We'll be back next time with episode 8.
We will be back with episode 8. For all of those people that said we wouldn't get past episode 5, here we are, ready for episode 8. See you next time. In the meantime, please follow the Angus and Pete Show page on LinkedIn for news and notifications. Message us directly to tell us what you want us to talk about, how we're doing, give us feedback, and keep our post bag full.
Show's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. So keep listening, like, subscribe, and also please share our podcast around to help us spread the word. But Pete, hold on. Before we go,
Yes.
It's Joke of the Week time.
Oh, Joke of the Week time. You put me on the spot again. Angus, how many salespeople does it take to change a light bulb?
Okay. I'm not even going to try and answer that question.
Angus, you don't need a new light bulb. You need to upgrade your lampshade and your light switch.
I could name 10 people that gave you that joke.
Cheers, Angus.
Cheers, Pete.
Thanks for tuning in to the Angus and Pete Show. Remember, it's based on the personal views and opinions of the hosts and their guests. If you're feeling aggrieved or litigious, Take a chill pill. There's already enough stress in the world. Don't forget to follow our page on LinkedIn and subscribe on your favourite podcast platform for more episodes. We'll see you next time. Oh, and tell your friends.